Hey everyone, welcome to a devlog for yet another new game. I'm gonna finish this one, I promise. This one is a puzzle game where you have to kill all the goblins, so this little guy right here, with a sword by defining the behaviors of the sword. And let me show you how that works. So I'm gonna go ahead and click this one over here, and we see that we have a start box here, which is automatic. It's got an arrow pointing to an action. Now I can click this add action, and I get a list of things that I can supply here. So for instance, this one is a throw. So I'm going to go ahead and click throw, and now I have a couple of controls here. I can determine the speed on a scale of 1 to 5 for this, and I can set the angle. So let's just set the angle, something that's going to way overshoot this guy, and we'll also put a little bit of spin on it. And I'm going to click play, and we can see that our sword gets thrown there. Now, that's not too exciting, so what happens if we go over here and click this button that's begging to be clicked over here? Now I can define my own trigger and action. So the start is given to you because you need to start somewhere. We're not going to ask the player to put a start node in there manually, right? So we have a start, and then it goes into a throw, and then that will go into another trigger. So the trigger that's available to you on level 1 is bounce. And this bounce basically says, take the following action after this number of bounces. So I'm just going to set it to 1 bounce so we can really see how it's going to work out. And let's chain that with another throw here. And I'm going to send it back the other way. Let's keep it, the same speed and the same spin. Let's click play now. So watch this. So it's going to hit the wall, and it's going to come back and kill the goblin. And then we get a level complete screen with a next level and a retry. Let's go ahead and see what the next level is. So now this is a more complicated level, right? And basically we got to figure out how to get the sword over to the goblin. Well, if you're thinking, well, we'll just utilize the bounce trigger, you'd be right. So I'm just going to really quickly throw something together. I basically already demonstrated this, but we'll just kind of do this one more level to show how it's going to work out. And let's actually do 2 bounces here. And let's do a throw and send it back. Let's add some spin. So we're going to go throw it at an angle towards the ground. It is going to be full speed. Then it's going to bounce twice and then get thrown at an angle as shown here. So let's see how that works. Okay, so I've just run it, and I can see that it didn't work. I can reset the level up in the top left and click play again. And see, well, yeah, that's not going to work. So I'm just going to pop back into my number 2, and I'm just going to make the angle a little bit steeper there. All right, that's closer to what we want. Maybe I'll change the initial throw angle so it's a little bit... There we go. Okay, and I can change this one back. And this is just a matter of, this is the whole game, is trying to figure out which combination of numbers makes everything work out. So I was able to complete that level, and that's basically it. I can retry if I want to just see that again. And that's the game. So I'm going to talk about what I've done so far, what challenges I had to overcome, and then I will talk a little bit about what's next. So let's pop into an old version of the game and show you what that looked like. All right, so here's an old version of the game. As you can see, the UI is a little bit different. So this version was actually in direct response to a post I made on Reddit. It was well received in the Godot subreddit, but one of the main pieces of feedback was that the UX was not great. And you can see what the UX is like in the new version, but I'll explain some of the problems that I was trying to address in this old version here. The main complaint was that players were not able to see the level while they were editing behaviors here. And I figured, well, we could probably solve that by making this just sort of like a semi-transparent overlay over the level. And I thought that would work out fine because you can still see everything. But the main problem was I actually tested it on my Android device, and my Android device is not operating at full brightness to conserve battery power. And what I found was when I played it on my Android device, I could not see the level behind the behavior edit because the brightness just wasn't bright enough. And so I figured, well, that's obviously not going to work. So that led to the sort of changes that you see in the new version, which are to show as much of the level as possible while also showing the behavior on the same screen. So worst case scenario, you're going to see something like this, where you have the numbers on the left-hand side, the control buttons, that eat a little bit of space into the level and obscure a little bit when you're editing here. But if you have the luxury of being on a bigger screen, you can eliminate that entire problem. So that's how the new version addresses that problem. One other problem with this version of the game the Godot physics were not deterministic. So when I was making this version, I was relying entirely on the Godot physics, using rigid bodies built into Godot and everything like that. And what I noticed is, given the same set of input parameters, I was not guaranteed to have the same result every time. And let me show you what that looks like. So I'm just going to throw the sword over the goblin at a 300 angle with full speed, and let's add a little bit of spin just for some more variability. So I'll go ahead and run that. And let's take note of where the sword lands. Okay, so the sword has landed kind of close to the right edge here. So let me reset this and go again, and we'll see where the sword lands. And you can see, okay, so that's obviously a very different result, right? The sword is facing the opposite direction. It got hung up on the side here a little bit before it finally fell down. That was totally unlike the original behavior of the sword. And I did a bunch of work to try to make this not a problem. I tried rounding my numbers every physics process frame. I tried rounding the positions, the angles, the velocities, trying to make them whole integer numbers to reduce the amount of floating point imprecision error that was built up. But I came to the conclusion just by inference that there was something underlying the Godot physics system that was adding randomness or non-determinism into it. And I wasn't sure how I was going to go about doing this, and then I had a hunch. I thought that maybe I'd try to implement a popular physics library called Box2D. And the fortunate thing about using C# with Godot is that I was able to find a .NET library for Box2D. And so that's what I did. So here is Box2D-X. This is a C# port of the C++ Box2D project. Now, this one hasn't been updated in a while. The last commit was on January 26, 2019. But that wasn't a meaningful commit. If we go in here, this was just a git ignore commit. As far as I can tell, the next recent commit was, February 7th of 2016. So this hasn't been updated in quite a while. But nevertheless, I decided to give it a shot, and didn't really require much work. I just had to change the target framework version from 4.0 to 4.7 to match my project version. And then I was able to stick the DLL that I built out of this into Godot and hook that up. And there was a little bit of work to get the Box2D stuff to work specifically, which I might go more in depth in later. But let me show you a new version of the game now with Box2D implemented. Okay, so this is a version of the game that has Box2D. You'll notice that it's very similar to the other old version that I showed you, but this was immediately after implementing Box2D. And let's do something similar. So let's just say a 300 angle. And I don't remember what these numbers were, but I think that's right. Okay. Now let's observe the sword. Okay, that's pretty easy. The sword is facing to the right, and it's a couple pixels away from the wall there. So let's reset and do it again. And you can see that it does the same exact sequence every time. Given the same input, I get the same output every time. And this was the point where I figured out, okay, my solution worked, and now I was able to proceed with the Box2D work. So that ultimately culminated in this version, which has a better UI, it has Box2D physics, and I'm going to get the same result every time. So let's just go ahead and retry this a bunch. And you see that the sword hits the wall and slides away in the same manner every time. No variability whatsoever. And it works beautifully. Okay, so that's just sort of an introduction to this game. I hope you think it's interesting. In terms of what's next on my radar here, I'm going to be working on a little bit of sound design because there's no sound yet. I'd like to get some chunky sword sounds in there and some like meat sounds when the goblins die. I'm going to add more behaviors and actions. One of the behaviors that I did not show you this time around was the ability to shoot an arrow from the sword's position. So maybe I'll show you that in the next devlog. And I'm also planning on creating different enemy types with vulnerabilities to different specific actions. So for instance, there might be an enemy type that has a wooden shield, and the shield protects against the sword and arrows, but maybe there's a new action type like a throw hatchet type, which will break wooden shields and subsequently kill the goblins. So those are the kind of things that I'll be working on next. Obviously, there's still some UI stuff to polish up to. That'll be sort of like a work in progress. And then the final thing I need to do is I need to come up with a name. So if you guys have any suggestions for a name, feel free to hit me up. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this. Follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description below. And I'll see you in the next devlog.